Hey everyone, welcome to Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast. This podcast is all about farmers markets, how to increase your market business success while providing people with fresh food. Farmers markets are essential. Whether you're a farmers market manager or a small farmer or food maker selling at farmers markets, you have found just the right podcast. This week on Tent Talk, we're chatting about vendor retention and how to keep a consistent market lineup. Hey everyone, I'm one of your hosts, Bridget Myers. I'm a longtime farmers market manager and education coordinator at Farmers Market Pros.
And I'm Kat Fields White, Director of San Diego Markets, still an active farmers market manager and consultant, founder of Farmers Market Pros, and host of Intense, the Farmers Market Conference, and the Farmers Market Pros community.
And I'm Justine Marzoni-Mead, Tent Talk producer and marketing director for Farmers Market Pros and logistics coordinator for the Intense, the Farmers Market Conference 2023, coming up in March, before we know it. Before our very eyes.
Before our very eyes.
Any second now.
It seems that much faster, too, because it's right after all the holidays and everything, which always zips by, even though we're super busy. So,
So get your tickets.
Very soon we'll all be together in San Diego, guys.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Me too.
Today's episode of Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast, is supported by Square, helping small farmers, food makers, crafters, and market managers increase their incomes by easily processing credit card and debit card sales on the street and in the tents. We use Square ourselves, both for selling shopping bags and T-shirts at our market info booths and for invoicing farmers and vendors online for our space fees. Square's user-friendly system makes it easy to track inventory and payroll and generate clear reports. For more information on reducing stress and increasing your income with Square, click their logo on the resource page at farmersmarketpros.com.
Welcome back to Tent Talk. This week we are talking about how to retain vendors at your farmer's market.
This is a good one.
The fun game we play. Will they go or will they stay? Yeah, hanging on to farmers market vendors can definitely be like herding cats. They're a bunch of creative, independent business owners who sometimes want to do their own thing.
Yeah.
Which of course they can do.
Which of course they can do.
We're not their boss.
No. But we are kind of their landlord.
Yes.
Kind of their landlord. We kind of have to tell them what to do.
They have to follow our rules, but we're not their boss or their mom. It's interesting.
But they're actually our client because they pay us.
They pay us, and we have to listen to them and, discuss how to help their business, but they have to show up on time.
Yeah. And also what's, I think, particularly interesting about this relationship and farmers markets themselves is that it's not these gigantic businesses most of the time. A lot of times it's these micro businesses that oftentimes are one individual or maybe a collection of individuals. And what's great about really small businesses is they're nimble and can make decisions quickly. Mm-hmm. But sometimes in the farmers market world, that means that people are making decisions without much notice. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes the vendor turnaround can be they're in one day and then the next they're not.
Yeah.
So it can make our job a little bit more tricky.
And it's hard to... it's a business. It's a business for them. The market is a business for us. We have to make decisions based on what's best for the market as a whole. But it's not as though we're in an HR or leasing office somewhere far, far away. We're actually dealing with people that we know very intimately, face to face. We know what they like to eat, and we know whether they're a late person, whether they're a morning person, or whether they're kind of cranky until the third cup of coffee. So it's a very hands-on, right there kind of relationship.
Yeah. I can't really think of another business relationship I've had quite like this or anything near it. So it's a combination of a lot of relationships in one.
Yeah. Which are wonderful in some ways.
Yes.
And also very tricky sometimes for one side or the other or both to not take business kind of decisions personally.
For sure.
And the turnover or when a vendor leaves or when a new vendor comes, that doesn't just impact your relationship with that vendor. It impacts all of the other vendors in the market.
And the customers.
Yes.
And how the customers feel about a market.
Yeah.
Yeah. And which is a good point. It's nice to have those kind of conversations with the vendors and kind of maybe discuss your relationship and how them popping in and out affects the market and things like that. I think a lot of background explaining is helpful when trying to explain why you want them to stay and talk about retention with them for sure.
Yeah.
Communication is the key for sure.
Yeah. So before we talk about vendor retention and the different ways to do that and how to keep your vendors around, I thought we'd just touch quickly on some of the different reasons why vendors leave, because it's not always a big sad thing. It's sometimes planned, it's sometimes not. So just off the top of your head, what are some of the different ways or some of the different reasons why a vendor might decide to pull out of a market or no longer do markets at all?
Sometimes it's about the market. Like they say their sales are too low. And depending on where they are in their market evolution on that particular market, maybe their sales are low and maybe it's predictable that they'd be low at that stage. But maybe they're low because that particular market is not a good fit for them. Sometimes it has nothing to do with the market. Their business is underfunded. They've got cash flow issues. When the van breaks down, they can't figure out how to transport their stuff. Sometimes it's that simple.
Yeah.
That they
And they're
end
not
up out of
good
a market.
salespeople. Maybe they're great at making a product, but they're not good at selling it. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons that sales can be low, including that market is not a good fit and the market is not buying their product and they're doing everything they can. But it's not always a reflection on the market.
Yeah. One that we've seen recently is a lack of employees or their employee schedule. They just can't, really get a handle on, and that could be because of the current state of the workforce. Or also we've seen in the past too when a business is really expanding and they're actually doing well, but they can't keep up the production and their production team is too strapped to come to the market. Actually, one of our vendors this happened to recently. They're expanding into retail and wholesale, and they couldn't cover both fulfilling wholesale orders and working the markets.
So sometimes they just succeed right out of your market, and that's always sad. The lack of employee thing is huge right now. Sometimes there's a perception that there's too many of a certain kind of vendor in your market. They're upset because you brought a new granola vendor in, which may, in the long run, big picture, be good for them, but hard for them to see that right that minute. We've had some podcast guests, I think, that have talked about having to work through those things with their market managers and getting their feelings hurt because there was a new baker and, working their way back. So sometimes that's it.
Yeah. Or they get pulled towards a new market.
Squirrel.
Yeah.
New sparkly market.
Which can sometimes look appealing, especially if the rent at that new market is low, which we've talked about very recently. We had an awesome conversation about starting new markets and setting market fees. So sometimes that happens. A new market comes along and the rent looks low. And
yeah, because they do the incentive kind of rents to get vendors in. And so they switch over. Yeah, that's true. And just not having anything in your rules that prohibits them from popping in and out. I mean, so they say, oh, well, cool, I'm going to pop over and do this new market for a while. Really low rent. It's a new thing. People will be talking about it. It's good. And I can always go back to that market. And if your rules don't say that, no, they can't come back because they've upset the customers by popping in and out, then, of course, they have reason to expect that. So I'd suggest you write those rules so that you make clear, what's required, how much notice you want, all those good things.
Yeah, explaining ahead of time what the rules are at your market for a vendor to leave under whatever circumstances, either weather, can you call out? No. Like, can you leave a market and come back? No, or whatever your rules are at the market.
Or sometimes you can come back. We've had people that came back, but it's because they followed our rules for how much notice they have to give so that somebody else can prepare to fill their space. And
like, don't burn the bridge. You can go and then come back. Or if they're opening up a shop and they think they can't do markets anymore, they go do their shop, but then they do have the capacity to send a team out to one or two markets, then they can come back. But, of course, it's all conditional, again, with, speaking to the market ahead of time and being open communication and not leaving them high and dry. So just spelling that out in your market rules and having those conversations with your vendors will really save you and also them a lot of that kind of hairy situation you can get yourself into.
We usually explain those things in so much detail. And yet, every once in a while, we had a new vendor recently that we loved. They had a very differentiated plant kind of product. Customers loved them. They were in for, I want to say, 2 or 3 weeks. And then one morning, they just didn't show up at the market. And we called them. And he said, I'm not coming today. It's like, well, did you send us an email or anything? He goes, no, what?
It's like, what's an email?
Scratching my eyes
I'm supposed
out.
to tell you if I'm going to be there or not?
It was sad because I like that.
I like them too, and of course, this is the best way to get somebody to just do that is to write a big feature in your email newsletter about them that day, which
and take
I did.
a million photos of them.
So many. We did a whole marketing campaign. That's just a bad sign.
Yeah,
so,
it was bad. And it makes customers sad.
Yeah, it makes customers sad.
Yeah.
And it makes you as a market manager might get sad when people leave your
Yeah,
market.
yeah.
It's hard for me not to be personally offended when people leave the market under even if they're growing their business and doing something great or opening up a shop and all those wonderful things that I really do want these little businesses that we kind of incubate at the market to do. I still feel sad.
I know.
Yeah.
And
do
I
too.
also feel extra sad or mad if they leave because they're your market sucks. I'm going to go to this other market. I'm just like, hey. And then
It's funny, though, because sometimes people have a hard time telling you exactly why they're leaving.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why, but they'll kind of do things in their head. We had a guy that left a relatively new market recently. He fulfilled almost all of his commitment, but he's 2 weeks short. But he said, well, I'm just going to have to leave. The numbers are just too low. I'm not making enough. I said, well, let's look at this. Do we want to adjust maybe your menu for this market? It's a different kind of audience, and you want to adjust that, and let's maybe try you in a new location. He goes, oh, no, I don't have the staff. I'm like, okay. So are you leaving because your sales are low or because you don't have the staff? And he goes, no, I don't have enough staff. I was like, well, okay, why didn't you just say that?
Okay, we'll get you guys some staff. We'll just get hired.
Yeah,
He's like,
right.
no, I'm moving out of the state. Just go through every excuse.
My grandma died. My dog ate my homework.
50 ways to leave your lover or your market.
Ooh, that'd be a fun song that you could change your lyrics to for our conference.
We're doing that at the conference.
Sing-along.
It'll be a sing-along, yeah.
Dave, get
50 ways
get the
to
guitar
leave your
ready.
market. I like that.
That's got potential.
Yeah.
Oh,
All
we're
right,
all
we'll
going
work
to be
on
so
that.
sad.
Oh, my
So
goodness.
speaking about, we're going to kind of go down the line and talk about different ways to retain different types of vendors. And the first one that I feel like is really tricky is retaining those new vendors, those people that either just launched their business or they just launched the farmers market branch of their business. How do you keep them when they realize that operating a farmers market business is tough?
I mean, we have this whole section in Vendor 101 to teach people that you need to make kind of a minimum commitment to a market when you start for good reasons, right? Because that's how sales are built.
Exactly. And I think explaining to vendors ahead of time that they can't tell if a market's going to be good for their business in 2 Wednesdays at the market.
Yeah.
So just really, we go through that in detail in Vendor 101, but I try to always just have that, quick talk with the vendors when they come and say, look, you have to give this market some time because you're going to be a new vendor. Shoppers are going to see you and they're going to say, oh, there's a new vendor. Like, I'll check that out later. Then next week they might get a sample. We go through the whole thing. And then the next week they're out of town. And then the next week they'll buy a little bit of your product. And then you'll start developing those regular shoppers. So the vendors can't, like, if they leave on the 3rd week because they don't think they're going to make any sales, that is just like not a true story most of the time.
Yeah.
So explaining to them like, hey, be in this market for 6 weeks minimum. Sometimes we ask for 12-week commitment on a brand new market, that the market is brand new as well because we all have to grow together. But building those habits takes time. And so we want the vendors to get the clearest picture of that. So just communicating that. And it's like, we care about your business. That's why we want you to do this. This isn't because we want 6 weeks of fees. It's because we want you to really recognize that you are a good fit for this market and you can continue your business and your business can thrive here.
Because it's such a shoot yourself in the foot thing for the actual business when they're just in for a couple of weeks. Right around that 3rd or 4th week when people start recognizing them and looking for them, if they've popped out to another market or given up markets, they've just been ready to reap all the benefits of the time that they put in, and then they're not there to do it.
Yeah, it's kind of like the scientific method of like, if you change too many variables or you hop around too much, you're not going to really know what it is that's working and what it is that's not working. So you have to be able to commit to a certain amount of time where you can gather enough data to kind of figure out the pattern. And that gets a really good point that we'll mention a couple of times, but that's one of the reasons why we launched Vendor 101 is to
Right.
give new vendors a really, really clear idea of what they're in for, and also just showing them like you need enough funding to let you get through that testy amount of time.
So
Yeah,
much less money
background.
than you need in reserve to open a brick and mortar, but still some money. You need some reserve
Yeah.
to start a new business,
the
no matter
startup.
where you're starting it. I have frequently actually sent the link to the podcast with Eric from 7 Seas to new vendors sometimes because he started this coffee business, and his very first week at the Pacific Beach Market, he sold a cup of coffee. And he said he
Yeah.
thought to himself, I have made a giant mistake. Maybe this wasn't a good idea. But he had committed to 6 weeks, and he's a
Yeah.
guy that honors his commitments. And the next week when he came back, he actually sold a few cups of coffee and some pounds of ground coffee. And then the week after that, it was a little bit more. And now, he's opening whatever his 4th brick and mortar location. He's a superstar. But he started in Vendor 101, and he remembered that story and hung in there. But if he hadn't, he very much after that first week was inclined to say, oh, man, this is not for me. I shouldn't be at farmers markets, or I certainly shouldn't be at this farmers market.
Yeah, and we were joking just a second ago about the curse of putting a vendor in your newsletter, and of course they're going to call out on that day. But a couple ways in addition to just clearly communicating, giving them some education, rooting them on, telling them, holding them to this commitment. I think a simple way to kind of keep new vendors on the hook is giving them some love in your newsletter, on social media, showing them that you are kind of, as a market manager and as a market that you're, anteing up and sharing their products with your followers and saying, we're going to help promote you. And obviously it didn't work out for that one vendor when we highlighted them in our newsletter. But
typically it does. I mean, it doesn't really – I don't really think it's a curse. I think if we highlight these vendors and we show them like, hey, we're invested in your business. We want your business to succeed. It kind of is just like they'll respect the market management more, and it's hard for them to ditch out on someone they respect. So it's like we respect them enough to want to watch their business grow and want to have them be a part of our market family. And they respect us enough not to leave and to stay in the market and be a good business there. Or if they do need to leave, to be upfront and have that conversation and give notice and leave in that kind of right way.
Yeah.
So all those things let people know that it's easier to build a business as a group and not just on your own. Then the other thing that I think is really helpful in getting people started and getting them off on the right foot and keeping them past that first couple of frustrating weeks for new vendors is making sure that they know the market rules.
Yeah.
Shani Flannery brought this up to us on a podcast, I think, a couple of years ago. Make sure that they know what's required of them so that you don't end up having to scold them in some way or correct their behavior in some way for things that they didn't know was a problem. I think she was talking about, I was playing music at my booth and somebody yelled at me. She goes, they probably didn't really yell. They probably just said, turn off the music. But, I felt embarrassed and I felt uncomfortable. And those human feelings of feeling embarrassed are the primary reason people avoid things. And so that may be a reason that a vendor doesn't come back to you, is that they've been criticized for something they didn't even know was not okay. So being really clear on your market rules about setting up on time or breaking down early and all those things can really help to make the whole experience more comfortable for people so that they feel like they're in a safe place as they're struggling through those few new weeks and not like they're putting themselves out to the people that are supposed to be on their team are picking on them.
Yeah. When you feel embarrassed, you want to run away.
Yeah.
So don't make your vendors feel embarrassed so they'll want to leave your market.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. They need to feel like this is who's got their back.
Yeah. And doing stuff like introducing them on social media or, sending them an email and say, hey, we put you on our website, or, introducing them to other vendors at the market. Just little things that you can do to make them feel welcome. Like you said, it may not totally impact the long-term viability of their business, but if it is the difference between them giving you 2 weeks notice and just a no-call, no-show, that can, if they feel like they're welcome, they're more inclined to follow the rules, even if they're not going to stick around.
For sure. Yep. So retaining vendors at new markets is
a little trickier.
You're all going through that like painful growth together. So while you are going through the growth of your market, the vendors are also trying to grow their business at a new market. And so you're in this kind of shared excitement / misery.
And I feel like
it's so much more important to retain vendors at that point.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing as you're building a market is building that trust relationship with customers that if they come back next week, they're going to have that same thing that they fell in love with the previous week. And
I'm way more anxious at a new market about vendors leaving than I am at our regular market. It's like, okay, if they leave, we'll get new, it's like a really built up market. Like I feel more comfortable at a new market. I'm like, oh, they better show up. Like we better get that street full. It's just so important.
And correct me if I'm wrong, because this new market that we just opened was like the first one that I was around on the operations side, so kind of seeing more of the back end of it. But I feel like at a brand new market, retaining long-term vendors that have been in the farmers market game for a long time is even a little bit harder than retaining brand new vendors, because these old school, like long-term vendors have years of data. They have kind of a lot more experience, so they can look at a market and make maybe a more educated guess of how that market is going to be for them long term. And if they don't have their immediate goals met, they might want to jump ship because they have a bunch of other markets that they can do.
Well, the other thing is, I think long-term vendors, we did just open a new market, and when we were looking at building the vendors that would open that market with us, we want to have some folks that have been in our other market for years because we trust them and we know what their product looks like and we know their booth will be clean and they'll be on time and all those good things. And we know that customers from our existing markets will follow those folks over to our new market and find what they expect from a San Diego market. But then we purposely try to make sure we have a selection of new vendors as well, because the vendors who are with us in a really big market that's producing a ton of sales, even if they've been there for a really long time, they forget that in the beginning, that market did not throw off that level of sales, and it takes a while to build that customer base. And I also think it's really important to tell people that we know that week 2 and 3 are not going to be anything like week 1. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they're very sad. If they haven't been in a new market in a long time, because you do all your media and you do all your marketing and people are really, really excited to come out and see the, new shiny sparkly thing. Yeah. Everybody comes out for grand opening. And then it's like, oh, you're going to be here every week? Cool. Well, I'm not going to come back next week because the kids have soccer and then I'm going on vacation, but, I'll catch you back later. Well, that's a big letdown for the farmers market managers and the vendors and the farmers that second week and that third week. And then gradually people are coming back and they're making it a habit and they're starting to show up every week. But like a new vendor at a market, that takes a good 6 weeks, maybe 12, to get to the point where you've got a steady supply of customers. And that could be really scary for people. It's not as scary if they know that that's just how that works. So we try to be really clear about telling people if they're new or reminding people if they're established that that's the natural progression of a new market, and that there is going to be a lull between that grand opening day and by 6, 7, 8 week where you're really flowing. We've been surprised actually at this particular market because they had a market in their neighborhood years ago. It closed 5 years ago. It's back now. So we've actually had much less of a lull in between those first weeks and now. So that's been a relief, but we absolutely prepared people for, I know this grand opening's huge, but it might not be like this next week. And luckily for us, it actually was only about 20% off. Sometimes it's your grand opening day on your second week are maybe 80% off.
Mm-hmm. Yikes.
Yeah, and so it scares people who were really excited that first week.
And if you're just pretending like everything's fine, then they don't really, the trust kind of starts to drift away. So I think we talked about this a lot when we talked about opening a new market, but also showing that you are doing, like, you're hanging door hangers like on that third week, and you're inviting more press out on that 6th week, and you're continuing to work like through the first 12 weeks of that brand new market. And so they see you doing that, and then they want to stick around because they know, like, hey, we're all building this together.
Yeah, that's a really good point of, like, not only communicating to them that, like, okay, times might be tough, but saying you want to stick around to see when this investment pays off, because it takes time to have the word spread. And once it finally does, you want to be on the ground floor of this new thing.
Founding member of the market.
But I have a question, because I know that we have you have a 12-week commitment for a new market. But what happens on week 12?
So what we try to be careful to do is to not put every new vendor at that new market on a 12-week commitment. So
Gotcha.
Some categories will be on 12 because it's really important for shoppers to be able to see a continuous showing of farmers, for instance. So our farmers pay much lower rent, but they have a longer commitment on a new market because we don't want them fading as the market's new.
Basic grocery items.
Yeah,
like
basic
bread
grocery
and
items that they're going to want to count on. But then we have other vendors that come in that we only do a 6-week commitment. And then we sometimes stagger start dates. So we want a fairly full market the first day that we start, but we also want customers to want to come back every week and see what's new. So we make sure that for the first 6 weeks or so, we have a few new people starting each of those weeks. So it's never, you don't want to miss that third or fourth week of the market because something new is going to be happening. And that also means that person's commitment is starting then, because you don't want to get to a week, even if everybody fulfills their commitments, which I'm going to give you a clue here, that doesn't happen. but mostly our folks fulfill their commitments. But you don't want to have week 13 where everybody says, okay, I gave it a try, I'm out. And all of a sudden you've got a market that's half the size it was on week 12.
Or like the
that's
snake
not good.
has shed its skin and it's a completely different looking
new
market.
Yes.
Nobody recognizes anything.
We've had that.
You don't want to do that. So
before.
that whole process of staggering the start
really
dates and the length of commitment so that, it's like the whole Senate doesn't change at once. Those things are staggered.
I wish that would happen.
That could happen. Yeah. And
that might be good.
Yeah. But you try to, or boards, if you're on a nonprofit board, a lot of times the terms will be staggered so that you've got some institutional memory and you've got some new people mixing up there. So we do the same thing at markets.
Yeah. But food, you want that standard food to be there available for you. So staggering really helps, and explaining it really helps for sure. And then retaining vendors at long-standing markets is also a full-time job. Like, and it requires maintenance. It's not like, okay, I got through my 12 weeks. Like, this market's like up and running now. Like, check retained vendors. Like, just check the box and then you're done.
It's ongoing.
It's every week.
Every week.
It's in a constant retention conversation. And some vendors that you think are going to be with you for a very long time end up leaving for one reason or the other. So you know, are constantly kind of having to deal with that on a revolving basis. Those longer standing markets, I mean, at our oldest market, there is not a lot of vendor or farmer turnover. It's such a large market that we are dealing with a lot of new vendors and subs and things like that just because we have so much space. But overall, percentage-wise, a lot of those vendors stick around for a long time. But it's because we create a situation and where they want to stay and we
Right,
maintain
when it's
that.
so busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was actually odd because we had been in a situation for a while. And, you know, there's the mythical waiting list that people hear about on a big established market where, we can't get in there for 2 years. Well, it depends. Do you sell mustard? You can probably get space next week.
The waiting list in the sky.
Pickles? Yeah, pickles.
Pie Pops?
Yeah. So when you're looking for certain things, there are openings that come up. But we had a period of a few years where we just didn't have any baked goods leave, and we were really full on baked goods and, you know, several other categories like that. And then COVID. So the crank down protocols meant that we had vendors that couldn't vend for 15 months. And when we invited them back, some of them had found other lives. You know, they weren't doing that anymore, or they'd moved out of state to be with family, or that. So that's the first time we had a big established market and a new market kind of all at once.
Yeah,
it was
that felt really different.
Yeah.
And even like a lot of our non-food, we don't admit a lot of non-food at our big market, but we had some long-standing non-food items, just jewelry and glassware and all that kind of stuff. And those vendors obviously left during COVID, and they weren't allowed to come back until the last phase, basically. So it was like farmers and then grocery and then non-food. And by that time, some of those older vendors had just drifted away, or they didn't feel comfortable coming back during COVID time.
People were tired.
They were tired. They didn't want to be out in public and things like that. And so we actually had some like non-food openings at the market, which really don't come along very often. So it was not. I hope that they're all doing well, but like it was nice to get some new vendors in there as well as at a long-standing market.
Well, and seasonal markets sort of have the same thing, I think.
Yeah.
So a long-standing seasonal market is also going through the idea that you've got a lot of people that are going to come back year after year, but I would imagine, you know, if you're only open, some markets have seasons as short as 2 or 3 months. Hi, Vermont. And then a lot of markets do like a 6 or 8 month season. Well, in that 4 months, I would imagine there's some shuffle. So you're dealing with trying to keep your existing vendors engaged while they're off for 4 months from your market. And then you're also having to look at recruiting and retaining new vendors, because you really are kind of starting a new market each year, even though you've got that base of established folks.
Yeah. I've talked to a lot of farmers market managers at the Intense conference about like they have a seasonal market. So we'll always get chatting and they're like, so you just keep the same vendors year after year after year. And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, so you get all new vendors every year. They have to apply and come in. And they're like, yeah. And it's just this weird, like, interesting.
Interesting.
We're both running farmers markets, but it's just this different kind of vendors in and out. And there's definitely so many pros and so many cons to both of those things. Because sometimes we get like, it feels like we're stuck with a vendor who's like, you know, not just kind of punching in. Yeah. So I know we've had a whole episode about this before where it's like, how do you reinvigorate a vendor that's been there for a long time? Because we don't really ask our vendors to leave.
And then equity issues come up because somebody that's been in for the 13 or 14 years that the market's been there means that category is full, so you can't let a new, young, hungry, maybe more diverse, you know, vendor from a more diverse population in.
Exactly. But if you're doing a seasonal market and you can kind of do reapplication every year, that's kind of a pro to that because you can let all those new folks in, or people that are really energized and are going to make your market more vibrant and exciting and be ready to sell. So,
both interesting.
Both ways.
So in terms of keeping those vendors around, keeping them committed, I mean, we're rule people. We're market managers. We like to have rules, and I think it's you guys have had long, successful careers in managing markets, and I think it's because we have some rules that people follow. So first and foremost, if you don't have any sort of rule about a weekly commitment to your market or some sort of commitment to your market, whether it's year-round or seasonal, you should develop a rule about that. It will just make your life easier. It'll make it easier for your vendors, and then enforcing those rules to make sure that they're following them.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about this. When you have rules, the two keys are communication, so people know what the rules are, and consistent enforcement. You can't say, I really like that guy, and his wife and I go, we're in the book club, and I don't want to kick him out even though he's always late. Not good. You've got to be consistent. Everybody's got to play by the same rules.
Yeah, and not just having rules about, a weekly commitment or, making sure you're there when you say you're going to be there, but even things like vendor behavior.
Sure.
If one vendor is kind of a jerk and they're being a jerk to everybody, it might impact not the vendor retention of that jerk, but of all the other vendors. Or if somebody is complaining about sales and it's because they're showing up late and breaking down early.
And wandering the market during sales time and not being in their booth, so customers are frustrated.
That could be the reason why they decide not to stay at your market. So just auditing your rules and making sure you're enforcing them is going to help your vendor retention.
Yeah, and I always think I'm always like, oh, this is so many rules. I'm always I'm cracking down on it, and I'm having to have these hard conversations with people. But over the many years, we have had a lot of vendor feedback, usually after a new vendor or farmer business gets up and running and they kind of work out the kinks with themselves. But they will come to Kat and I and they will say, we appreciate that this market has such structure and you guys consistently enforce the rules, because we never knew how important it is that we all open at the same time. And now that we have our, stuff together and we're opening and then we're at this other market and our market neighbor is not even showing up until half an hour into the market, it's very disruptive. It disrupts our sales. So they start to the rules start to kind of click in their head. And I always think of that when I'm having to get into a rule conversation with a vendor. I'm like, they'll appreciate this. They will appreciate this. And it's kind of how I feel with my kids. Look, I got to draw a hard line here. You're going to appreciate this when you're older. And so you kind of think the vendors, you are really doing them a service to give them this structure and to make sure that they are aware of the rules ahead of time and also that they need to follow the rules or there's consequences. You're doing them a service. You're helping their business.
You're helping their business because, as we talk about all the time, a lot of these folks are passionate about what they grow or what they produce or this recipe that they're making and bringing to market, but they don't necessarily have a lot of background in what makes the most effective retail presentation or what the rules of retail are that engage customers, like consistent hours.
Yeah, professionalism doesn't always occur to creative types, and I can say that because I am partly a creative type. So I feel that if you just kind of readjust them and kind of scoot them over to the line where yes, you can have all your creative, amazing stuff, and then also you have to be professional or this is not going to be lucrative and you're not going to be at this market for very long. Yeah. So you're wasting your time and your money and everyone's time and money. So kind of getting on the same page with your vendors is important.
And that segues really nicely into another way that you can help retain your vendors is if you notice them struggling or their business if their display looks tattered and torn or they're looking tired or something weird is going on. We had an episode recently about this, about helping vendors out, but help them out, direct them towards a podcast like this one. Or, our good friends at Come Through Market, they have a farmer training program, and that has really, really helped the retention of their vendors because they know that those farmers are set up for success when they enter the market. They have some basic business training, and they are able to sustain themselves through slow days because they know what it takes to get through those slow days. So making sure that your vendors are set up for success is going to keep them around longer, and it's going to help you out. It's going to save you hours processing applications and finding new vendors to fill those spots.
Oh, yeah, because recruiting and quote-unquote training new vendors is a lot of work. You'd rather have a successful vendor that keeps making it, and we want to see businesses succeed. We're actually doing a series of workshops with the Oregon Farmers Market Association with a group of 12 market managers that are learning kind of some nuts and bolts about how to train vendors, how to nurture vendors. You don't want to design their business. That's not your job. That's their job, and they get to make all those creative decisions. But as a market manager, what kind of things can you do that will just give them some tips and give them a little step up on making those businesses more successful? Yeah.
Another one I know we've talked about a lot, too, in the past is curating your market. I think that this is one thing that a lot of vendors complain about is oh, there's too many of this type of item in the market. And they are drawing a correlation between that and their sales that they may be unhappy with. And
at some point there is a correlation between that. So it's really,
definitely.
It's a whole juggling fine line trapeze artist sort of thing to make sure that you provide enough choice in terms of feeding the customer's desire to be able to choose between these 4 bakers and diluting the sales so much because you've got 8 bakers and only so many customers looking for it that nobody's really making a profit.
Yeah. So making sure that you're carefully vetting your vendors and thinking about the overall balance of your market.
Yeah, we were just talking about that with placing them in the market too. Like, don't just put this person in this prime spot because they applied first. Like, think about your map, and because that might not even be their best spot to be. They might do really well next to this other vendor because they complement each other. So you need to put those tents together somewhere. So just thinking ahead and being thoughtful about your map and being thoughtful about who you include, because other vendors will want to be a part of your market if your market is clearly nicely curated. So.
Yeah. And another one that when I was a vendor, I always appreciated about the way that y'all operate the markets is that you were pretty clear about where our booth rent was going. Like you had a little line item that said it was going towards marketing and advertising. And I think that this, especially if your market is a large market, that maybe the rent is a bit higher than other markets in your area, letting your vendors know, like, hey, these are different amenities that our market has because you're paying this money. And if somebody starts kind of haggling with you about their booth rent or is threatening to go somewhere else because they don't charge as much, kind of just saying like, hey, look, we have traffic guards and this helps the shoppers have a safe experience. And that is one of the things that you're paying for when you're paying your rent. And I think having kind of those open discussions is helpful for vendors that are considering moving on to a different market or something like that.
Yeah, because a market that has really, really bottom of the barrel kind of really low rent oftentimes doesn't have enough money to operate the market to provide staff to manage EBT, for instance, or to answer customers' questions, or they can't afford anybody's time being spent on keeping up with social media or sending out email newsletters. So a little bit more in rent can lead to a market that's actually more vibrant and profitable for the vendor, but unless you explain that to them, that's not something you're just born knowing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just explaining like, yeah, we have a big social media following. We spend a lot of time, promoting on Facebook or, posting somewhere else or participating in other community events. And we pay our staff. I think sometimes you may have to explain to your vendors that your staff are not volunteers if they are not. If they are, that's like a separate conversation. I'm sure you're paying for lots of other things. But I've had to tell, like, it doesn't occur to me anymore to really talk to people about that. But sometimes I'll talk to them about the marketing fee. And it's like, yeah, well, we have to pay our social media manager. And they kind of look at me like quizzically, and I'm like, I have to pay staff to be here at 5:30 in the morning? And they're like, huh? I'm like, we're not volunteers, And so it's like, they're like, oh, because I just, forget that people don't realize.
I have no vendors often that say, oh, your volunteers are so cool. And it's like, no, they're paid staff.
They're paid
They are
staff.
cool, though.
They are cool. We pay our staff well. And yes, that's where your vendor fee goes as well, because we have great staff, which makes the market great, which brings the great shoppers, which helps your business. So kind of explaining the circle of that.
Yeah.
That's important.
Yeah.
And then a really easy one that we all get busy and miss sometimes, I think, is to tell your vendors that you appreciate them.
Yeah.
That's a really good way to keep them in the market. It sounds really simple, but not everybody thinks to do it or has time to do it. The very first year I was a market manager, I gave out holiday cards to all of our vendors, and some of them actually cried. They said, oh, I've been a vendor at this other market for 10 years and nobody's ever said thank you. Things as simple as that can make a big impression.
Yeah, and I mean, at the conference, all the people we talked to on the podcast, the market managers are in our private Facebook group. Like, it's very evident that they love and care for their vendors, and they're like invested in their businesses. And sometimes it's like you have to enforce the rules and you have to kind of be like a crabby landlord to like get stuff done. But just having that like little connection, and sometimes it's in the middle of a fight that you're having and you just have to be like, hey, I appreciate you. I value you. I'm glad you're here. And that seems like it can really solve we were just talking earlier today about a vendor that's been a long time vendor, and they're kind of being a little pale, but it sounds like you had a really good mom talk with them. And
I did. Had a good talk and
we'll
let
see
them
how
know
it goes.
that. Yeah, hopefully that's all good. But yeah, I mean, the talk was that we have had some really good years of the past, and lately, not so good. You've had, not quite the level of respect for our team and things and other vendors that you should. Let's try and get back to the point where we were happy because we really like having you here.
Yeah.
And I think you like being here. Mm-hmm. Let's figure out what's causing those, where are those sore points? What's rubbing your heel there that's making you be cranky? Let's see if we can figure that out so we can all have a good time again.
Yeah.
But part of that conversation, even though we were having to talk about some hard stuff, was reminding him that we really do appreciate him being here.
And he adds great value to our market.
Absolutely. Yeah, customers love him.
Exactly. Having that kind of mutual respect, I think, is what it all comes down to. Like, they help them understand that they should be respecting the staff and respecting the market as a whole, but then also show them that you do respect them. And they're a business owner. We recognize that. And just bringing that to their attention, it can really go a long way.
If you have the time or budget, some kind of bigger, splashier thank yous can be cool too. So, we've had years where we've printed a T-shirt for every single vendor and vendor employee at the market that, had a logo and a funny saying on it. And we've had kind of slowed this down during COVID, but hopefully people stop being contagious and we'll get back to it. We've typically done a party once a year where the vendors and farmers get a chance to actually talk to each other and have an adult beverage and hang out. And we don't spend a ton of money on it, but we spend a little bit to feed and lubricate them. And they end up having a good time. And that makes such a difference in their attitude about the market. They understand that they're part of a team.
They feel invested.
And even simple stuff, depending on your budget, you might not have space for that. But even just like heartfelt shout outs in your newsletter or social media, or, if you get their permission, sharing exciting fun things. I just actually forget what farmers market it was, but I just saw on Instagram this morning that they shared like all the new mini vendors, and they just shared like a photo of all the different babies that were born for the different vendors, and like stuff like that. I feel like really endears your vendors to you, and you all are part of a big, wacky, happy family.
True. And actually that leads to one last thing about how you retain vendors is you make sure they are part of your big, happy family. Vendors and farmers and market managers have a funny relationship. We have farmers that we know will show up no matter what kind of market or event that we do, just because we've built this relationship. And we will go to a farm dinner if they have one, and we will buy from them every week, or we'll send people to buy from them. You actually do develop your own little tribe of people. We see neighborhoods come to us and say, we want you to open a market in our neighborhood. And we'll say, well, we're kind of stretched on bandwidth, and maybe this other person, they're like, no, we like the vendors that go with you. So there is a kind of a thing that you develop where a group of vendors are loyal to a certain farmer's market manager and vice versa.
Yeah. And we don't drag our vendors that trust us into a new market that we don't think is going to be successful.
That's true.
And that's part of the
a whole
trust.
other podcast.
Yeah.
And that's part of the
But
trust.
that is why
so
they
we
trust
say,
us.
no, we wouldn't bring them into this market. We just don't think it's going to be a great, place to have a market. And so they trust us not to drag them into that. So
so I guess the actual baseline of that piece of it is that you want to be careful that you're watching out for your farmers and vendors' best interest, and then because as they know that you're doing that, they're going to stick with you.
For sure.
Yeah.
Big, happy market family.
That's right.
Yep. We'll retain those vendors and keep doing the good work.
That's right. See you next time. Thanks for listening today, and big thanks to Square for helping farmers market participants and managers increase the income and reduce the stress, and for supporting Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast. To sign up for easy credit card processing on site at markets, simple invoicing back at your desk, and cash flow bridge loans, just click the Square logo on the resource page at farmersmarketpros.com.
Farmers markets are all about connection, and all of us, operators, farmers, and vendors, keep learning. Connect with people just like you from various parts of the country and share what's happening in your area in the terrific conversations over in our private Facebook group, the Farmers Market Pros Community. If you're actively involved in a farmers market, please find us there, answer the 3 qualifying questions, and join the group. You can also message us on Instagram at Farmers Market Pros or email us at connect@farmersmarketpros.com. If you're looking for further education, check out our online course offerings at farmersmarketpros.com. Thanks for listening to Tent Talk. Please leave us a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you access your podcasts, and tell us and others how you're enjoying Tent Talk. And be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss the next episode. Tent Talk, the Farmers Market podcast, is proudly produced by Farmers Market Pros, where passion meets profit. Today's episode was recorded and edited by Justine Marzoni-Mead. Original music by David Mead. Thank you so much for listening today, and we'll have another great episode next week, so tune in.